Early July 1942, Lunga Point, on the north coast of Guadalcanal, a name that meant nothing to most planners in Washington or Tokyo before that spring. Japanese construction crews are grading a strip of ground between two rivers, more than 2,000 laborers working under the eye of engineers from the 14th Construction Unit, cutting jungle, laying fill, running a runway toward completion weeks ahead of schedule. By early August, the work is so far along that commanders authorize extra rations of sake to celebrate. Somewhere out on the ocean that same night, an invasion fleet carrying the 1st Marine Division is already closing on the island. The airfield the Japanese are about to finish building, they are about to lose before they ever fly a single mission off it. And the men who take it from them are going to finish the job faster than the men who started it ever could. Guadalcanal itself was not the prize. The airfield was. Whoever controlled a runway at Lunga Point controlled the sea lanes and air routes between the United States and Australia. And both sides understood that with total clarity by the summer of 1942. Japan had surveyed the site in May, started serious construction in early July, and thrown enough labor at it, more than 2,000 men between two separate work crews plus several hundred civilian laborers, that the strip was nearly finished by the first week of August. A functional strip, roughly 3,800 feet long, built in about a month using a mix of hand labor and imported heavy equipment. The Japanese engineers who built the first version of this airfield were not slow. What they could not do was hold on to it long enough to matter. On August 7, 1942, United States Marines came ashore at Lunga Point and overran the defenders so completely that by 4 o'clock that afternoon the airfield, along with intact stores of food, radio equipment, and this detail carries the whole rest of the story, working Japanese heavy construction machinery, was in American hands. The Japanese work crews had fled into the jungle rather than fight, leaving behind bulldozers, generators, and grading equipment that the Marines' own engineers had never expected to inherit. The airfield was roughly 90% complete. What remained was finishing work, drainage, surfacing, extending the strip enough to handle real combat aircraft rather than light transports. The 1st Engineer Battalion started that work almost immediately, using the enemy's own machines to finish the job the enemy had nearly finished for them. Marines walking the captured strip found half-graded earth, stacks of construction material still under tarps, personal effects the fleeing work crews had left behind in their hurry. Small signs of a job interrupted mid-shift rather than lost in battle. There was no dramatic firefight over this particular piece of ground. It simply changed hands because the men building it chose not to die for an unfinished runway, and the men who inherited it understood immediately what they were sitting on. The first aircraft to touch down was a Navy P-by Catalina on August 12th. 5 days after the landing, a flying boat that came in to evacuate 2 wounded Marines and left again within the hour. On August 16th, the strip was formally named Henderson Field after a Marine dive bomber pilot killed weeks earlier at Midway. And on August 20th, 31 aircraft, 19 Wildcat fighters, and 12 Dauntless dive bombers flew off the deck of the escort carrier Long Island and landed at Henderson Field to stay. That squadron earned itself a nickname almost immediately: the Cactus Air Force. Cactus being the code name for Guadalcanal itself, and from that day forward there was American air power based permanently on an island the United States had held for exactly 13 days. Japan had spent roughly a month building an airfield it never got to use. The Marines had turned a captured, unfinished strip into an operational fighter base in under 2 weeks. The men who flew off that strip in the months that followed became some of the highest-scoring American pilots of the entire war, John L. Smith and Joe Foss among them, both eventually awarded the Medal of Honor for kill totals racked up almost entirely over this one stretch of contested coastline. What their combat records rarely capture is what the airfield itself was like to operate from. There was no rear area to rotate back to for rest. Pilots slept within sprinting distance of their aircraft because a scramble order could come at any hour, ate whatever the supply runs had managed to get ashore that week, and flew missions on airframes ground crews were patching with parts cannibalized from wrecks because replacement engines weren't making it up the same contested supply line fast enough. A pilot's war at Henderson Field wasn't measured only in the aircraft he shot down. It was measured in how many mornings in a row the runway he needed was actually there to take off from. That was the opening move. Holding on to it turned into a different kind of fight entirely, one that ran for the next 3 months and had almost nothing to do with capturing ground and everything to do with a runway's ability to absorb damage and keep functioning anyway. Japanese cruisers and destroyers came down what the Americans nicknamed the slot most nights, shelling the perimeter, and Japanese bombers flew down from Rabaul on a schedule regular enough that the Marines gave the recurring nuisance raids their own names. Every one of those attacks put craters in a runway that had exactly one job: launch fighters and dive bombers fast enough to matter. A cratered runway that takes days to repair is not a functioning airfield. It is a target. Life around the field settled into a rhythm the men who lived through it never fully forgot. A lone Japanese float plane, engines deliberately left out of sync, so the drone never quite resolved into a steady pitch, drifting over most nights to drop a bomb or 2 more to deny sleep, then to do damage. The Marines called it Washing Machine Charlie for the sound it made. Somewhere back in the hills, a Japanese artillery piece they nicknamed Pistol Pete lobbed shells onto the strip on its own schedule, forcing work crews into slit trenches at moments no radar or lookout could predict. Japanese troop convoys made high-speed runs down the slot, often enough that the Americans called the whole pattern the Tokyo Express. And every one of those runs was a reminder that the ground fight for the island and the fight to keep the airfield flying were really the same fight fought around the clock. Malaria took down more men some weeks than combat did. None of it stopped the runway from needing to be open by morning. This is where the Seabees enter the story. Naval construction battalions, sailors trained as engineers. Carpenters, heavy equipment operators, men who in civilian life had built roads and bridges and were now doing the same work under fire. The first contingent, 392 of them, landed on September 1st, 1942, and went straight to work extending the runway another 1,300 feet and surfacing it with something called Marston matting, interlocking sheets of perforated steel, each one light enough for 2 men to carry and lock into the next without special tools. Laid down over graded earth or crushed coral, it created a runway surface strong enough for heavy aircraft and, just as importantly, fast to repair when it got hit, pull the torn sheets, fill and tamp the crater beneath, lock new sheets over the top, and a hole that would have grounded a dirt strip for a day became a 15-minute job. A Marine officer named Blundon, watching the pattern of nightly raids settle in, later put a number on what his men could do. 100 Seabees, he said, could repair the damage from a 500-pound bomb hit in 40 minutes. Not overnight, not the next day, 40 minutes. They built special trucks loaded with gravel and filled specifically so crews could drive straight to a fresh crater and start closing it while the smoke was still clearing. And fighters that had scrambled ahead of an incoming raid would sometimes circle the field burning fuel they could not spare, waiting for a strip to reopen underneath them before they ran dry. That system got tested at a scale nobody had planned for on the night of October 13th into the 14th. By then, the airfield had already survived 2 serious ground offensives meant to overrun it outright: the failed attack at the Tenaru in late August and the harder fight at Edson's Ridge in mid-September. where a numerically superior Japanese force under Major General Kiyotaki Kawaguchi pushed to within a few hundred yards of the runway's edge before Marine raiders and parachutists holding the high ground broke the assault in 2 nights of close, brutal fighting. Rear area clerks and headquarters staff were issued rifles and told where to fall in if the line gave way. It did not give way, and both times the airfield held for the same underlying reason: Cactus aircraft could still get airborne to support the Marines dug in around its perimeter. The ground fight and the airfield survival were never really 2 separate battles. Japan's next plan skipped the ground assault and went straight for the runway itself. To cover a major reinforcement convoy heading for Guadalcanal, the Japanese combined fleet sent the battleships Kongo and Haruna, escorted by a light cruiser and 9 destroyers, down the slot with orders to put Henderson Field out of action completely. They arrived off Lunga Point undetected and unopposed, and at 1:33 in the morning opened fire from roughly 15 miles offshore. Over the next 83 minutes, 2 battleships fired 973 14-inch shells into an area barely half a mile square. Men who survived it described a sound with no gaps in it, one continuous roar rather than individual explosions, the ground itself moving under them for over an hour while they lay in slit trenches with nowhere else to go. Tracers and muzzle flashes lighting the tree line offshore every few seconds like heat lightning that never let up. When it stopped, both runways were cratered almost end to end. Nearly all of the airfield's aviation fuel was burning. 48 of the Cactus Air Force's 90 aircraft sat wrecked on the ground. 41 men were dead, 6 of them aircrew who never got the chance to fly. By any reasonable military calculation, Henderson Field should have been finished as a combat airfield for days, possibly weeks. Kongo and Haruna had fired more ordnance into that strip in 83 minutes than most of the campaign's earlier raids had managed in months combined, and they'd done it with naval rifles built to punch through armored steel, not the smaller bombs the Seabees had trained to patch in 40 minutes. Dawn came up over a field that looked less like an airstrip than a moonscape. Craters overlapping craters, burned-out fighters and dive bombers pushed into the wreckage of their own revetments, smoke still rising from what had been the fuel dump. Seabee crews were already out on the surviving section of runway before full daylight, working past the bodies still being recovered, hauling fill and steel matting to close the gaps fastest. Because every minute the strip stayed closed was a minute the approaching Japanese reinforcement convoy got to keep coming unopposed. Those crews, supported by Marine engineers, had 1 runway back to working condition within a few hours of the last shell landing. It didn't look like the strip had looked the day before. It looked like a war zone with a landing lane cut through the middle of it. But fighters could take off from it again before the sun was fully up, taxiing around craters still being filled to reach a stretch of matting just long enough to get airborne. The fuel problem was its own scramble. With the main tanks burned out, ground crews and Seabees went plane to plane and drum to drum, hand-pumping whatever gasoline had survived the fire out of wrecked fighters and buried reserve barrels into buckets and jerry cans, just enough to get a handful of Wildcats topped off and into the air. The Japanese battleships had steamed away at first light, believing, reasonably, that they'd bought the coming reinforcement convoy days of uncontested air cover over Guadalcanal's approaches. They'd bought it perhaps a single morning. The very next night, October 15th, Japanese heavy cruisers under Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa came back and shelled the field again for another 30 minutes. This time hitting ammunition dumps and tents on top of what was left of the runway surface. Repairs resumed almost as soon as the shelling stopped. Because by this point in the campaign, patching craters at Henderson Field wasn't an improvised emergency response anymore. It was a rehearsed procedure, timed, resourced, staffed by men who'd done it enough times that speed had become routine rather than heroic. The first repair after the first raid in August had been scramble and improvisation. The repair after 973 14-inch shells in October was closer to a drill, executed by crews who already knew which trucks to load, which sections to prioritize, and how long they had before the next flight needed to get airborne. Why couldn't Japan match that? Not because Japanese engineers were incompetent. The same men who'd built the original runway in a month, ahead of schedule, using imported heavy machinery and disciplined labor, plainly knew their trade. The gap was in what came after construction. The Americans arrived on Guadalcanal with an entire military branch built around the idea that combat engineering needed its own dedicated force. Trained, equipped with standardized modular repair materials manufactured by the thousands of tons back home, rotated in behind the infantry as a permanent fixture of every campaign rather than an afterthought. Marston matting alone was a mass-produced, interchangeable, shippable solution to a problem Japanese engineers were still solving with more improvised methods and thinner logistical support the further their supply lines stretched from home. Japan could build an airfield fast when the work was uncontested and the timeline was measured in weeks. Sustaining that pace under nightly bombardment, 600 miles from its nearest secure base, competing for scarce transport tonnage against everything else the Imperial Navy needed just to keep the campaign alive. That was a different problem entirely, and Japan never solved it. The distance mattered as much as the doctrine. Every ton of cement, every replacement engine, every fresh company of construction troops Japan might have sent to match what the Seabees were doing had to come down the same contested waters the Tokyo Express was already using to move rifles and rice. On ships, Cactus aircraft were actively hunting the moment daylight returned. Japanese soldiers on the island, malnourished and increasingly desperate as the campaign dragged on, took to calling it Starvation Island in their own letters home. The Americans shipped in standardized steel matting by the ton and rotated fresh construction battalions through on schedule. The Japanese rationed rice and pressed exhausted infantry into labor whenever the professional engineers ran short. Carpentry had stopped being the question by October. The question was logistics. Which side could keep feeding men and material down that same 600-mile line long enough for speed to become routine instead of a one-time miracle? The Japanese Army and Navy did not give up on retaking the field after October 14th. They planned another push in November, again built around battleships bombarding Henderson Field to open the way for a fresh reinforcement convoy. And this time, the United States Navy moved to intercept the battleships before they ever reached firing range, in the action that became the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Some of the aircraft that helped finish off the crippled Japanese battleship here that November were flying off the very runway Kongo and Haruna had tried to erase 3 weeks earlier. Planes launched off a repair job 3 weeks old, from a strip that by every calculation the Japanese had made on the morning of October 14th should have been unusable for the rest of the campaign. The airfield the Japanese had built in a month, lost in a single afternoon, and tried twice more to destroy outright, was still there, still flying missions. When the campaign for Guadalcanal finally turned for good in February 1943, you could tell this story with nothing but the numbers. The shell count, the aircraft destroyed, the 40 minutes it took 100 men to close a crater, and those numbers would do the work on their own. Underneath them sits a simpler comparison that decided a 6-month campaign. 2 militaries needed the same runway. One of them could build it fast when nobody was shooting at it and had no answer for keeping it open once somebody was. The other built almost nothing from scratch, inherited a captured strip, finished it in days with the enemy's own machinery, then spent 3 months proving that speed under fire was the only kind that actually decided who kept the airfield. Somewhere in the historical record is the detail that Japanese engineers celebrated finishing this same runway with extra rations of sake in early August 1942. A full month of work, done right, ahead of schedule, by men who had every reason to be proud of it. They never got to taste the payoff. Every battleship, every bomber, every night raid that followed for the next 6 months was really just Japan trying and failing to buy that afternoon back.